Hello and welcome to the Consistory of the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host of this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of St John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. Now we're going to be continuing my lecture series on what it means to be a Lutheran by going through Luther's 10 Commandments, and on today's video we're up to the 7th commandment, which is you shall not steal. Luther said in the Large Catechism, to steal is nothing else than to acquire someone else's property by unjust means. These few words include taking advantage of our neighbour in any sort of dealings that result in loss to them. Stealing is not just limited to robbery or theft, but includes all forms of dishonest and unfair dealings and the seeking of gains at the expense of your neighbour's suffering. Now, each of these 10 commandments have three chief characteristics: their origins in the natural law, the overarching command and what it seeks to protect, and the outreaching nature of the commandment and what it all covers and deals with. So, the natural law of the 7th commandment can be found in the creation week. After the creation of Adam and Eve, God set aside a tree that belonged to him. Adam and Eve were forbidden to eat from this tree. In doing so, God establishes the concept of private property and the law of not taking that which does not belong to you. Later, we see in Genesis 4 the concept of ownership and private property. As we see, it speaks in Genesis 4:4 about Abel sacrificing his sheep, designating his ownership of these sheep. The principle that this commandment seeks to protect is our property. As Luther says, the next thing God wants to be protected is temporal property. This commandment is not only about not taking something that your neighbour has, but also about not harming your neighbour's property or taking advantage of them, but instead seeking to protect and preserve what they have, and when the opportunity arises, to provide for them, promote them, and benefit them. As Luther said in the Small Catechism, we are to fear and love God, so that we do not take our neighbour's property or money, nor acquire them by dishonest trade or crooked deals, but instead help them to improve and protect their income and property. This commandment clearly forbids theft and robbery, that is, the use of force in theft, and it also includes all forms of any stealing. That includes illegally downloading movies without paying. Now, although the Bible does make some exceptions around property, for example, in Deuteronomy 23 verses 24 to 25, a person was permitted to go into their neighbour's vineyard and to eat grapes off the vine, or to go into their neighbour's wheat croft and pluck heads off the grain. Now, Jesus' disciples do this in Matthew 12:1-2. Here the Pharisees condemn the disciples not for stealing the grain, but for plucking grain on the Sabbath, which the Pharisees deemed to be, breaking the Sabbath law. Deuteronomy 23 does not consider it stealing to eat the fruit as long as you're not taking it with you. Verse 24 permits you to eat your fill of grapes, but forbids you from filling a bag with grapes. And verse 25 permits you from eating grain, but you're forbidden from cutting down the grain to take with you. This exception, though, was not for everyone, but was specifically for the sojourner and the poor. See the context of Deuteronomy 24:19-22, where the Israelites were where the Israelites were commanded not to thoroughly harvest their crops, but instead to leave some behind for the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan. As Pastor Mark Brown says in his People's Bible Commentary on Deuteronomy, it was a person's duty to offer hospitality to the traveller and to provide for the poor. As Luther teaches, the 7th commandment expects of us to give of our property to provide for those in need. As Luther says, when our neighbour suffers any want, we are to help, share and lend to both friends and foes. Therefore, God commanded the Israelites to allow the sojourner and the poor to eat some of their crops when they were in need. But this commandment was specifically for those in need and was not to be abused by the lazy or dishonest. As Pastor Paul Kretzmann wrote in his popular commentary on the Bible, it was a privilege granted to the traveller, to the passerby who might feel hungry, but it was not to be abused by avarice neighbours. God sought a society in which people cared for their property and the well-being of one another, where the rich did not selfishly hoard from those in need and the poor did not greedily take more than they needed. The seventh commandment also provides any gains, the seventh commandment also forbids any gains through deceitful or dishonest means, or the gaining of goods through unfair and unequal means that seek to benefit oneself at the disadvantage of the neighbour. Now, regarding dishonest and deceitful means, Luther discusses this at length in the Large Catechism, condemning those who steal from their neighbours by defrauding them. Here, Luther specifically mentions those who sell defective merchandise, those who use false weights and measures, and those who use counterfeit money. To this, we could also add those who sell diluted products at the same price as undiluted, such as watered-down soft drinks, waterlogged meats to make them weigh more, or other products that have been bulked up with lesser quality products. In doing this, people have taken advantage of their neighbour and essentially stolen from them. To put this in perspective, if a person were to sell you soft drink that is 1/3 watered down, you may not think much of it. But if I stole 1/3 of your money out of your wallet, you would definitely notice. Luther considers these two acts as being equal. Now, regarding unfair and unequal means, this refers to those who make gains at the disadvantage of their neighbour. This includes things such as overpricing. Obviously, for any business to succeed, there must be some sense of profit. You must sell your products for a higher price than you bought them for. But there's a difference between doing this to gain some profit and selling something at exorbitant prices that it just clearly is not worth. Vice versa, underpaying is also wrong. Of course, everybody seeks to get a good deal and to save money when they buy something, yet there's a difference between that and paying far less than something is actually worth so that you disadvantage your neighbour. See, another form of unfair means is usury. This is the charging of interest at an exorbitant rate. Now, Deuteronomy 23:19-20 commanded the Israelites not to charge interest on anything that they loaned to a fellow Israelite, although they were permitted to charge interest to foreigners. Now, regarding the first point, Christians should not charge interest on things to their friends, their families, or their brothers and sisters in the faith. When you give someone a loan to help them in their time of need, do not charge interest. Instead, lend out of love and concern for your neighbor's well-being. But regarding the second point, the Israelites were allowed to charge interest to foreigners. This is about giving loans as part of a business and not as part of familiar love. For example, banks are allowed to charge interest on a loan without sin, for this is their business and their work. But in such a situation, the interest should be fair and reasonable. Usury is when someone lends at an extremely high rate. Often, this is done with a more sinister intent in which the lender knows that the borrower cannot repay such a loan and that they'll have to eventually declare bankruptcy, in which the lender can just take whatever they want. For example, there is a movie called Love's Abiding Joy. It is part of the Love Comes Softly series. In this movie, the mayor, who is also a businessman, Samuel Doros, he gives out loans to struggling farmers during a severe drought and cattle plague. However, he gives out the loans at an extremely high interest rate, knowing that these struggling farmers will never be able to pay him back. Samuel does this so that when the farmers are unable to make their repayments, he then just comes and confiscates all their livestock and property and everything in order to cancel the debt, and in doing so he increases his own herds and land holdings. Now, another form of unfair means is gambling. This, however, requires a bit of explanation, for there are many conservative Lutherans who just condemn any and all forms of gambling. However, if we were to take this to its logical conclusion, then we shouldn't participate in raffles even for charities, for that would also be the sin of gambling. However, the Orthodox Lutheran Fathers taught that gambling in and of itself is not a sin. If one were to gamble for the sake of entertainment, such as just playing cards and you got a bit of money on the side as just part of the game, then that was fine. The sin, however, behind gambling lay in the intent of the person who is playing. If you're gambling with the intent of getting rich and taking money from your neighbors, then that is considered theft. Alternatively, when we consider casinos or poker machines, if those who participate in these games have extremely unfair odds, then this too is theft by unfair means. Although regarding poker machines, they are not truly random machines at all, but they are programmed to only give out money once they have a certain amount of money inside. Thus, a person cannot truly win a jackpot by pure luck, but can only win a predetermined small amount once the machine has gained enough money for the owner to profit. This then is actually not just theft, it is theft through dishonest means, it is lying. Since the player cannot actually ever win all the money in the machine, they can only win what money has been predetermined for them to have. So, in addition to not stealing, we are not to make gains through dishonest or unfair means, but should do whatever we can to improve and protect our neighbour's wealth and property. A good example of gaining wealth through dishonest and unfair means versus assisting our neighbour can be found in the book Hammer of God, written by the Lutheran theologian Bogietz. In the second story of this novel, there is a situation where the pastor must mediate between two of his parishioners. Now, the first parishioner had a prized bull, but he was struggling financially. So the second parishioner, seeing this, took the chance to get the bull at a very cheap price. Here, the second parishioner sought to make gains through unfair means, taking advantage of his neighbour's desperate situation. However, the first parishioner was also dishonest in his dealings, for it was later discovered that the bull had consumed some oil and therefore the meat was unfit for eating. Thus, the bull was actually worthless, and so the first parishioner who sold the bull sold it knowing it was defective. Here, the first parishioner sought to make gains through dishonest means by selling faulty goods. In this case, both are actually guilty of theft, and the pastor therefore instructs the first parishioner to return the money to the second parishioner because it was a defective product and therefore is a dishonest sale. Secondly, the pastor then rebukes the second parishioner for seeking to take advantage of the first during his time of need. And then thirdly, the pastor sets for them a good example by taking up a collection, by pulling off his hat, putting some money out of his own wallet into the hat, and passing the hat around to the other elders to take a collection for the first parishioner to help him in his time of financial need. This account of Bogietz is such an excellent example of the seventh commandment. It shows us how we should not take advantage of our neighbour, and it shows us how we should seek to benefit our neighbours rather than ourselves. So the seventh commandment commands us to benefit our neighbour and their goods. Whenever we do anything to harm our neighbour's property or disadvantage them, we are breaking the seventh commandment. This also includes things that are not taking care of your neighbour's property when you borrow it, for example. If you allow harm to come to your neighbour's property either through carelessness, neglect, or malicious intent to damage it yourself, you have essentially stolen from your neighbour. Another form of stealing is being an irresponsible employee. It is obviously stealing when you steal from your boss, such as taking money out of the cash register or stealing products off the shelf. But it is also stealing when you are lazy and do not work to the best of your abilities to benefit the business. As a salesperson, you have a duty to make sure the customer is taken care of and that you sell quality products at a reasonable price. At the same time, you have a duty to your boss to be a good and faithful employee. By being lazy or negligent in your work, you are harming your employer's business and not preserving their property or income. Especially if your employer is paying you to work and you are not doing as you should, as much as you should, or much as you could either. The worker deserves his wages, said the Bible. But if you are paid a wage and you fail to do the work that you should be doing, then you are stealing from your employer. Luther discusses irresponsible workers in his large catechism, saying, suppose, for example, a manservant or a maidservant is unfaithful in his or her domestic duties and does damage or permits damage to be done when it could have been avoided. Or suppose that through laziness, carelessness, or malice, a servant wastes things or is negligent with them. When this is done deliberately, for I am not speaking of what happens accidentally or unintentionally, you cheat your employer out of 30 or 40 or more gold in a year. If someone else had taken or stolen that much, he would be hanged on the gallows. But here the servant becomes defiant and insolent, and no one dares call him a thief. Now, in discussing the seventh commandment, one thing that is relevant to today's culture is the debate between communism and capitalism. So starting with the topic of communism, this is the idea that the country is just one large commune, that there is no private property, but that all things are in common, and that the government should take the wealth from everyone, rich and poor, and redistribute them as an equal share. The issue with communism is that it's not welfare, for the government does have the right to tax its citizens and does have the right to distribute wealth to the poor and the needy. In Ezekiel 34, God makes it clear that the kings had a mandate to care for the sick, the poor, and the needy. Thus, governmental welfare is a biblical principle. This is not the error with communism. The main error with communism is that communism rejects the idea of private property altogether. In communism, there is no such thing as yours or mine. All belongs to the state, and it is up to the leaders of the state to decide who gets what. This is the sin of communism. For the Bible is clear that private property is a God-given right. The government cannot just take your property. The best example of this is the case of Naboth's vineyard from 1 Kings 21. The king wanted Naboth's vineyard for his own private garden, but Naboth refused, for this land belonged to his tribe and had been assigned to his tribe by God when the Holy Land was divided up. The king could not just go and take it, no matter how much he wanted it. Many who are in favor of communism will point to passages in the Bible about giving to the poor and the needy. But the Bible does not say the government can just abolish private property and just give my property to whoever the government decides. The passages in the scripture are about giving to the poor. The passages in the Bible about giving to the poor are about Christians giving out of the goodness of their heart for the love of their neighbor, not under force or compulsion from the government. As the Lutheran theologian Hermann Susser said, Christianity says, what is mine is now thine, but communism says, what is thine is now mine. The Christian gives freely, but communism steals from the rich to give to the poor. In communism, the government takes what is not theirs and then redistributes it. Now, as I said above, the government does have the right to tax citizens, and it does have the right to give out welfare. Taxes and government welfare are not in violation of the scriptures. Communism crosses the line, however, when it says that nothing belongs to the individual and that everything belongs to the state. Communism abolishes private property and the state steals that which does not belong to it. Now, secondly, regarding welfare, as I mentioned before regarding Deuteronomy 23, this was meant for the truly poor and needy, not for the greedy or lazy. Welfare in the Old Testament was meant for the widows and the orphans, for women were not allowed to work in those days, and thus if a husband died, then if you were left without a husband or without a father, then you had no form of income. Welfare was meant for those who couldn't provide for themselves, either due to their inability to work or due to the lack of work available. Paul says in 2 Thessalonians 3:10-11 that he who does not work shall not eat, and he comments that some were refusing to work out of laziness and idleness. Here we see from Paul that welfare was not meant for those who refused to work. Additionally, in 1 Timothy 5 verses 8-16, Paul states that people should care for their own family first, stating that if someone does not provide for their family, then they are worse than unbelievers. He states that if widows are under 60, then they should remarry, while they are young and they can find another husband to care for them. If the widows are over 60, then they should have their children or their grandchildren provide for them first. And then, and only after all this, should the widows receive welfare. And of course, it was understood at this point in time that this welfare came from the church, not from the state, since the Roman Empire didn't have welfare. From this, we can see the biblical principles of welfare. Firstly, if you can work, then you should do it and not have welfare. Secondly, if someone can take care of you, then let them care for you first. Thirdly, only if neither of those options are available, then can the government provide welfare. Welfare is not meant to be a livelihood on which one lives. Instead, it should be a crutch upon which one leans before they are able to care for themselves. Thus, welfare should be for things like pensioners, or disability payments for the injured, or even job seeker for those who are currently unemployed but are actively looking for work, or also for parenting payments for single mothers who don't have husbands and fathers to help provide for them. But welfare should not be for the lazy who refuse to work. Such people are thieves who steal from the taxpayers, taking from the government that which they don't deserve. Regarding capitalism, on the other hand, capitalism is the idea of a full libertarian free market. This supports the idea of private property, and this is good. But where capitalism can fall short is the fact that capitalism often focuses too much on the individual. Where communism says there is no such thing as private property, capitalism often overcorrects and focuses too much on our private property in a greedy and selfish manner. Capitalism is all about personal gain and profit, even at the expense of the neighbor. This is not the Christian way, for Christianity teaches that we should give of ourselves to help the poor and the needy. Capitalism also often has companies competing with each other and driving one another out of business. But Christianity teaches that we should look after our neighbor and try and support them and benefit their businesses and to protect and preserve their property. As Luther taught, let all people know then that it is their duty on pain of God's displeasure not to harm their neighbor, to take advantage of them, or to defraud them by faithless and underhanded business transaction. Much more than that, they are also obligated faithfully to protect their neighbor's property and to promote and further their interests. Marketplace warfare is not in keeping with the biblical principle of caring for your neighbor and their property. You should care for your neighbor as much as you would like them to care for you. Instead, you should seek your neighbor's benefit and you should promote their business, even if they are a rival. You should not seek to drive their business to close. Capitalism says that what is mine, but Christianity says what is mine is thine. In the Large Catechism, Luther criticizes those who pursue wealth at the expense of the poor and the needy. Luther states that there must be governmental regulations to prevent dishonest and unfair trade in the marketplace, such as quality standards. As Luther wrote, it is the responsibility of the princes and the magistrates to restrain open wantonness. They should be alert and courageous enough to establish and maintain order in all areas of trade and commerce in order that the poor may not be burdened and oppressed. The error of capitalism is the inherent selfishness and greed that is manifest in such a society. However, we must clarify that capitalism, unlike communism, is not inherently sinful. Communism is sinful in its very nature, as it abolishes private property and attributes all property to the state. Capitalism, on the other hand, is not sinful by nature, but is sinful by execution. It is not the principle of free markets that is problematic, but the sinful people who, when left unrestrained, will take full advantage of their neighbour in order to benefit themselves. Therefore, as Luther advises, since people are sinful, there must be some form of governmental intervention to curb the wicked and to protect the weak and downtrodden. For the government does have the responsibility to curb wickedness and to protect the vulnerable. We must remember that the seventh commandment is about the protection of property, both our own and our neighbours'. This means that you should seek to protect and preserve your neighbour's property so that not only will you not harm it, but that you will not allow it to be harmed by any other. You must do your best to assist your neighbour in preserving their property. For example, in Deuteronomy 22:1-4, it says that if your neighbour's livestock breaks out and is going astray, you should not ignore them, but instead return them to your neighbour. Verse 2 adds that if you do not know the owner, then you should take it home with you and look after it until someone comes looking for it, and then you shall restore it to them. Verse 3 adds that you shall do the same with a lost donkey or garment. Here, donkey would be the mode of transport and would thus be equal to a car or something like that of today. Verse 4 adds that if you see the neighbour's livestock trapped in a hole, you should not ignore it but lift it out. In doing this, you are seeking to preserve and protect your neighbour's property. We should also seek to share and lend our property to those in need. 1 Timothy 6 verse 17-18 teaches that the rich should not be greedy and hoard their wealth, but that since God has richly blessed them, they should be rich in good works and share their wealth. As I said above, not under compulsion from the government, but out of the goodness of their heart and for the love of their neighbour. As 2 Corinthians 9:7 says, each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, but from the heart, for God loves a generous giver. The seventh commandment can be simplified to don't steal from your neighbour, either through theft or by dishonest or unfair dealings. Instead, seek to protect, preserve and promote your neighbour's income and property, and give generously of your own income and property to those in need. As Luther said, we will sum it up. First, we are forbidden to do our neighbour any injury or wrong in any way imaginable, whether by damaging, withholding, or interfering with their possessions and property. We are not even to consent to or permit such a thing, but are rather to avert and prevent it. In addition, we are commanded to promote and further our neighbours' interests, and when they suffer any want, we are to help, share, and lend to both friends and to foes. And that wraps up our lecture on the seventh commandment. Join us again next time as we continue our series, What It Means to Be a Lutheran, by looking at the eighth commandment.